Couch Football Nerds here talking Ohio State preview. We're going to try to make this quick, which means it's going to be really long because we'll start talking, and that's what's going to happen. Want to remind everybody, please like and subscribe. Click that notification bell. We are back, and when we take this hiatus, Google forgets about us, and they stop recommending us. So if you might maybe enjoy this and want to post it somewhere, 11 Warriors, something like that, where you talk ball and bring people to us, that would be great because the algorithm gets sleepy on us in the off season, and we are here to talk some football. Josh, we're going to start this discussion with you eating some crow. You told me that in confidence. I think it was a safe space. You thought it was, but I'm going to have you eat some crow to the Ohio State fans in a way that admits you were wrong about something last year that is really good sign for this year. And I'm going to segue that by saying the thing I told you that led to all that. And that might make y'all mad for a minute, but it's not meant to. It's actually a really positive thing. I don't think Howard is an elite quarterback. And I don't think it matters. I don't think, everybody is so used to getting crazy numbers and potential for actual first-round draft pick quarterbacks out of Ohio State, especially under Ryan Day. And if you really think about last year, you didn't need an elite quarterback. You needed someone who's good in a couple of areas where you were not. And so in saying that I don't think Howard is an elite quarterback and he's coming in as a transfer, because there's always this huge offseason optimism when you get a transfer in, especially if it's a transfer quarterback and you're at a big-time program and that quarterback's named the starter. Usually that means he is that dude. In this case, I think he's a serviceable quarterback who isn't elite, and he doesn't need to be elite for Ohio State to win the national championship. I do think if you had him last year, you would have been a lot closer to that goal. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to you.
So, yeah, I thought it was a safe space, Daniel, and then you made me admit I was wrong.
It wasn't. It never
I've never
is.
admitted I was wrong before, especially according to Michigan fans, because, we've never picked their games right except the times we did, and we've never admitted we were wrong except the times we did. But they're all still mad that, we said they cheated, which, maybe because they cheated. The thing to me that I screwed up, I think, last year was went through most of the year saying I didn't really think the issue was McCord, it was the offensive line. Look, I said that week 2, week 3, I was really hammering that point home. I'd said it in the preview based on the spring game, and I was really alarmed. I don't think I was wrong to be concerned about the offensive line. I don't think I was wrong to say the offensive line was a problem or a weakness. I was wrong to say that McCord wasn't ranking that much worse. I had a lot of Ohio State fans comment over the course of the year. It's like, yeah, but then he holds the ball for 4 to 6 seconds. And I don't think I took that as seriously as I should have, because the truth is he did. And there were a lot of times where there was a play to be made within the time span which he had to make it. And he had this guy named Marvin Harrison Jr. that he could not use because he could not get the ball out. That really hit home to me in that final game versus Michigan in the regular season. He was terrible in that game. I mean, he was awful. And the thing to me with Howard, in terms of yards per attempt versus FBS competition, we like yards per attempt just because in terms of numbers that you can understand, it's a pretty simple one. He threw for 7.1 yards per attempt. That was good for 58th in the country. Very average quarterback. I know it was Kansas State, not Ohio State. It was also in the Big 12. Wasn't in the Big 10. And he had some talent on that roster. I don't think Will Howard's going to set the world on fire. I do think Will Howard knows how to run an offense. I think Will Howard can throw the ball reasonably well. I think Will Howard is willing to run and isn't a skittish player. What you had for last year from McCord in key moments was often a guy that just looked shell-shocked. And to Daniel's point, the truth is, if you had a Will Howard on last year's team, if you had an average quarterback, which I'm just scrolling right now, you didn't even need a Talia Tagovailoa, right? If you were just talking Big Ten standard quarterback play, and let's see how fast I can do this off the cuff. Let's say
Penn State had one,
which again we did some videos where we just talked ball, played college football 25, but used it as an excuse to talk football. I played Daniel. Daniel later did it with R.J. Young. We had a great discussion previewing Oklahoma. Nobody apparently saw that or got a notification. So if you're interested, please watch it so that it exists. But yeah, in that Penn State game, I had a 99-yard touchdown run over with Drew Aller. Yeah, you can see how or why that happened, and it definitely wasn't a glitch. It was me and skill, baby. But if you had Drew Aller, if you had Hudson Card, I think you probably could have won that Michigan game. But he was a total turtle, head in the shell disaster, throwing, turning the ball over at the worst possible moments, missing throws. And I think Will Howard's going to take that away. So, we've also made the comment with Judkins. Look, I don't think Judkins is necessarily the greatest, the greatest running back on planet Earth either. He's getting really, really hyped up in College Football 25 and everything else. He wasn't a top 25 back in the SEC in yards per carry last year. Yes, he led the conference in rushing stats, but it's because Ole Miss plays at tempo. He had a tremendous amount of volume per play. He wasn't really great. I think he's a very good back. None of that matters. What matters is you have Travion Henderson to pair him with. What matters is you have talent across the board. You have talent at receiver. You have talent at tight end. You just need another guy to pair with Travion Henderson, whoever starts. And the worst case is you have a better backup to Travion Henderson. The best case is he ends up being the player that I don't currently think he is. But it's not going to take very much for Ohio State to take a step forward and to be a team that can win the Big Ten and play for a national championship. With the wide receiving core, Egbuka comes back, star player. You've got Carnell Tate. You've got Jeremiah Smith. This is a roster set up to be successful. And the big thing that I really want to get across is I think there's this focus on the new players. There's a focus like Caleb Downs at safety. You don't need these players to elevate your team. You don't. You need these players to keep the spots from dragging down everybody else. Because everybody else you have on this roster, be it JTT, be it Burke in the secondary, those guys are star players that are good enough to win a lot of football games for Ohio State. They are good enough to win a conference title. You just need to be able to fill up enough holes to be able to protect against injury risk with Henderson, what have you, that you can run the gauntlet and you can capitalize when you get there. That's a big difference for me between Ohio State and a team like, say, Texas, where I think Texas does need the transfers to be impact guys. Certainly, like Ole Miss is getting a lot of hype. They're only going to be good if those transfer guys pull them up. Ohio State's not in that position. You're reloading. You're not rebuilding. And, yeah, I have some doubts with some of these players and whether they're going to be everything they're hyped up to be. But I also, again, I just don't think it matters. I think what's going to make Ohio State really good is the players you had on the roster last year that are coming back, the guys that you've had that you've been developing. That's what's going to decide whether or not Ohio State is a conference title level team.
Yeah, and I think that people forget that Ohio State's – it seems like they have a different Achilles heel every year. It had been the defense. The defense had been a problem for a while, and it's unfortunate because they wasted some really good offenses. I think the defensive continuity is going to happen into this year. People forget, they still scored 24 points on Michigan last year, held back by their offense. They lost 24-30, but one of those touchdowns was on a 7-yard drive, right? If you look at the numbers, the box score, Michigan threw for 7.4 yards per attempt, which is not great. Michigan ran for 4 yards per attempt. Ohio State held them defensively to some of their worst numbers of the year, at least until they played Alabama. Their whole regular season every game was better than that one. They held Penn State to 12 points. So I think that on all of this, you just need to not be bad at offense, defense, or quarterback, right? To be when you have the talent that you have at Ohio State.
And just score more points than the other team. If you just do that, you'll win, right?
No, and I know what you're saying, but I'm saying you can't be bad at one unit. You can't be bad defensively like they were. It reminds me of, some of the team like LSU last year. They were so good offensively. They were elite offensively, but they were so bad defensively that it didn't matter. I think they still won 10 games, but how good is that LSU team if they have just a decent defense, right? That 2020 Ohio State team, great offense. That that Bama game, the problem for Ohio State wasn't that they couldn't score, it was that they got under they got buried so quick because of what their defense was doing that it took them out of their offense. And so I think last year was some of the same stuff. They were a really solid defensive team, elite defensive team maybe, and they were an elite offensive team held back by the only position on the offensive, of those 11 players that can really take an elite offense and turn it into sometimes mediocre offense. That leads me to a discussion, Josh. We're having it with all the teams. And it's schedules, but schedules through the lens of Super Conference era and how things have changed. So with Ohio State this year, they get to do the thing that Michigan did for 2 years, and we're going to give them a hard time for it. That's they don't have a Power 5 team out of conference. But some of that is shifted a little bit because they still have a tougher schedule than they normally have because of the Super Conference thing, where instead of playing a okay Wisconsin in a given year, I'm just using them as an example, they might be great this year, an 8-4 type somebody from the Big Ten West, they get Oregon, right? They still play Michigan, they still play Penn State. So they've got a schedule that is probably tougher in the sum total of it than they've had in the recent past, but they probably have more mulligans too because of playoff expansion, which maybe takes some of the pressure off and gives you a different way to approach the season in terms of getting everybody comfortable. You don't have to open the gate first game against an Oregon out of conference type of thing. What do you think about Ohio State when you look at their schedule? And maybe let's talk about how, I know it depends on what everybody else does, but let's talk about how many mulligans they might have to still make the playoffs.
My mantra in the offseason, just based on historical data, has been that 9-3 is really the thing you've got to do in order to make the playoffs. And that's based on a lot of real world discussion. And I'm trying to pull it up so I can actually quote the right person here. It was Dennis Dodd of CBS that made the point that since 1998, if you plug it into the current 12-team bracket, 28 9-3 teams would have made the playoffs. So about every year, you've got 1 to 2 9-3 teams that'll make it, and it's generally going to be the elite teams that lose close games to Michigan or whatnot that are going to be those 9-3 teams. So I would say 9-3 is when you're on the bubble. 10-2 is going to be guaranteed. It's almost never that a 10-2 team doesn't make it. So, I mean, that's going to be their mark. And, every year we deal with this whole, 9-game conference game slate, 8-game conference slate. We've often said that that's all a little bit of a red herring, right? Because most of the time, if you're trying to make a playoff, it's really about your 5 hardest games. It's not about your 12th hardest game. This year, Ohio State, love it or hate it, you can't complain. You have the same schedule effectively as an 8-game SEC schedule that schedules out of conference P5. Alabama plays an FCS, sure. They play at Wisconsin. They play 9 power games. You play 9 power games. The fact that they play an FCS when you play Akron, who, by the way, is probably worse than a lot of FCS teams, that doesn't matter. Neither one of you is going to lose that game. Neither one of you is probably going to have your starters in after halftime. It's irrelevant, no matter who it is. At a certain point, the difference stops mattering. You're just scoring at will anyway, no matter who you're playing. So I think the number of mulligans is probably 2 guaranteed, and that's crazy to say, but it's just almost guaranteed historically. You're almost never going to have a team from the Big Ten or the SEC, just looking at historical data and who's been in and what the top 10 looks like, that has 2 losses that does not get in this format. You got 2 mulligans. You maybe have 3. And when you look at the schedule, right, you play at Oregon, at Penn State, you got Iowa, and you play Michigan. You can drop the Oregon game and the Michigan game and make the playoff. I almost guarantee it. And so this is really, to me, this is as I said, it's almost like a Big Ten schedule where you play the out-of-conference game at Oregon, or you want to call it an SEC schedule. But it is kind of wild that the 2 games that are losable are really, really tough games. They've got 2 games that are straight up mulligans, and I think the rest of the schedule, some of these are a little dangerous, but I don't think they're that dangerous within the Big Ten. So, I think the odds of making the playoff are good. I think There's always a possibility of losing a game you don't need to, but Ryan Day has typically done that. Ryan Day has not laid the eggs that they laid under previous coaches. That's been a big point that you've made for years now. Even if he's struggled with a big game, he's not losing the easy one. He's not dropping the Purdue bomb or what have you. So they have a good chance to win the playoff. I think the way they play football should make them get in the playoff, and once you're there, all bets are off. I will say the thing that concerns me from this roster overall in that discussion is the offensive line. The same thing I said last year. I don't think Simmons and Fryer are great offensive tackles. And if you have a game where your offensive tackles are getting whipped, a lot of stuff can go really wrong really fast offensively. And there are enough teams on this, like Iowa, that are, do have the potential to really cause a lot of problems for Ohio State. So I think that's the big thing to me, is that they could end up in a couple low-scoring games. But otherwise, they've got plenty of mulligans for who they are as a football team. And you almost just have to beat one out of Oregon, Penn State, and Michigan if you want to think of it that way, and you're probably in the playoff.
And this is why you have to have these mulligans, and it's going to force us. I think it's going to take us a couple of years collectively to be able to calibrate and look at a schedule like Ohio State's, like Georgia or Alabama's, they are tougher than these, but Ohio State still has a tough schedule. And compare it to like a Missouri, who has a really weak schedule, that they might go 11-1 or 10-2 and not beat anybody of significance. But even within their own conference, you mentioned Iowa, and Iowa has Ohio State, but out of conference they got Illinois State, Iowa State, Troy, right? And then they've got Washington, who's not going to be Washington that we saw last year. Michigan State, Northwestern, Wisconsin. UCLA is going to be banged up. They have a brutal schedule. Maryland and Nebraska. So Iowa might be a normal 8-4 team that goes 10-2 or even 11-1 with this schedule and still not be very good. Whereas Ohio State goes 10-2 and could be the best team in the country. And so I say all that to say, because we don't have divisions anymore and because the top two are going to go, one of the top two teams in almost every year, in my opinion, now with super conferences in the SEC and the Big Ten, one of the top two teams is going to be a fraud almost every year. But I would rather get that fraud out of the way early instead of the playoffs. And I don't want that fraud to prevent a team like a 10-2 Alabama or Ohio State from being in the playoffs. So as two guys who have said we don't need playoff expansion, we do need it in the super conference era. We didn't need it before when everybody was spread out. The schedules weren't so imbalanced and some people weren't stuck with just brutal schedules. But you look at Iowa's schedule, and I think Ohio State moonwalks that schedule into 11-1 or 12-0. And I still think that Iowa could go, 10-2. Who knows what they're going to do offensively, but they could go 10-2 and finish in the top two in the Big Ten and be, one of the two representatives in the conference championship game. And there might be 4 teams in the Big Ten that are actually better than them, which is why we needed this expansion. Saying all that, I do think that it gives you coach it differently, and that's maybe where I want to take this in terms of discussing Ohio State. You coach it differently knowing you have a mulligan in your back pocket. Talk about how that might work with Ohio State in breaking in transfers and maybe holding stuff back off of film. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I'll expand quickly on what you said, which is just to make the point that Iowa has one ranked team in their schedule. Ohio State has 4, right? So your point is if Iowa loses their only ranked team, which, by the way, is Ohio State, they could still go 11-1. And Ohio State could beat half the ranked teams on their schedule and go 10-2 and be behind Iowa, having beaten them. Probably one of the more extreme examples of something we talked about in our Alabama preview. And this is something everybody's got to wrap their heads around. Look, we've fought back and forth with Big Ten fans and SEC fans, but especially Big Ten fans in recent years, that schedules aren't created equal. And up to this point, the argument's always been, well, the conference championship game is a de facto play-in to the playoff. And we've often said that's really not fair because, making the conference championship in the Big 12 is just nothing like making it in the Big 10 or the SEC, even before. But now you're going to have the problem where Iowa may make the conference championship in the Big Ten, and Ohio State doesn't, when Ohio State was clearly the better team and beat Iowa, because now scheduling within the conference is so disparate. We've never had that problem because you used to have divisions. The worst thing that would happen is somebody that won one division was worse than the team that won the other division, but you're at least more or less guaranteed that one of the division winners was going to be the best team in the conference. You almost don't have that guaranteed anymore. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And to your point, I think it causes a lot of differences, right? If Ohio State rolls into that Michigan game, you don't even need to be undefeated. If you roll into that game 11-1, you're already in the playoff. And now you start get some really interesting situations of what happens when you're 11-1 and Michigan's 12-0 and you're playing the game, and whoever loses, it doesn't matter, you're playing again the next week in the conference title. How up for that first game are you? I mean, at what point, and there are going to be a lot of people that scoff at this, and there are probably going to be some people that are NFL fans that are totally buy into it. At what point do you start saying, okay, for the first of the game, I'm not going to really show you what we're doing. I'm going to hold back my playbook. I'm going to not play anybody that's banged up or injured. I'm going to hold those guys for the next week and play them in the conference championship game. Because remember, in the current playoff structure, only conference champions can get the auto bid top 4 slots. Now, I've harped on this a bunch. It's crappy because the 3rd and 4th champion gets the slot over any non-champion, meaning one of the Big 12 and the G5 every year, the top G5 champ or the top Big 12 champ, whoever's ranked higher, probably Big 12, they must be ranked number 4. The team that loses the Big Ten championship by rule, cannot be any higher than number 5. So if you're Ohio State and you're playing those guys back to back, if I beat Michigan the first time and I lose the second time, and let's say we're 12-0, they're 11-1, I beat them. They go to, let's say we end 12-0, they end 10-2, but we play them the next week and they beat us. I'm 12-1, they're 11-2. They still get the 1 or 2 seed. I get the 5 seed. And so you end up in this really, really screwed up situation where it's actually all that matters if you're both going to get in the playoffs is preparing for the conference championship game, because it doesn't matter what your record is. It doesn't matter if you got blown out in the first game, really. If you win the conference championship game, you become a top 4 seed. If you lose the conference championship game, you're seeded somewhere between 5 and 12. Period. That's the way they structured it. It's screwed up. My opinion, I've said this repeatedly, I think it's all a mistake. It should be ranked number 1 through number 12, just best through worst. I don't care if you have auto bids where the conference champions from the top, the G5 champion and all, are guaranteed admission. I don't mind that. I mind the seeding structure where the conference champions are the only ones that can get the buys. That's a problem. And it's going to create a problem at the end of the year. It might happen this year. It might happen another year. But it's interesting. And I do wonder if they're going to sit kids, if teams are going to want to sit players. There's going to be a push to not do it due to culture reasons. But if you're going to play a team back-to-back, ain't that weird? I mean, at what point do you just say that this game's going to be the conference championship? We're not going to play another one because we don't want to get hurt. If I was the conference, I'd want to do that. But they're not going to do it because of money.
If you get down in the second half, like you may not fight as hard to claw back when you're going to play them the next week. Or conversely, there's a lot of advantage in getting that 5th spot, right? Like you get a guaranteed home game. You're going to play probably a pretty crappy team.
Yeah, we've talked about that before. The number 5, the way the structure works, the G5 champion is guaranteed access. Remember, the top G5 teams are all Big 12 teams now. Cincinnati, UCF, Houston. They're going to be playing for the Big 12 championship. So, like last year, Liberty would have been your auto bid, number 23 that lost, 62-6 or something, 56-6 to Oregon?
To Oregon.
Yeah, that's going to be your number 12 due to auto bids. So the number 5 seed gets to start with a home game that may well be a tune-up game versus the auto bid G5. Well, everybody else has to sit on the couch getting cold. And then because of the way the seeding works, the number 5 seed, their route to the championship goes through number 4 rather than number 1. So you're almost better off being the 5 seed because for the first few rounds you get the easiest teams for like the first 2 to 3 rounds. And you kind of get to stay warm. Whereas if you win the championship game, you may be number one, and then once this gets going, you actually have to play harder competition throughout the bracket. It's a really screwed up system, frankly.
And it's a lot of it's screwed up because we still have conference championship games, which we shouldn't have. Because, look, you might be playing in that 12th game in the regular season and say, hey, I don't even want to go to the conference championship. Just give me my number 5. Give me my guaranteed home game. And the revenue that brings on campus money, having butts in the seats. It's a little wild. All right, one last thing I want to do before we kind of wind down this Ohio State discussion is go through their schedule, and kind of tell me, like, let's go on record as saying what we think their end of the season record is going to be, and kind of go through it that way. I'll start and I'll say this: like, I think that the beginning of the season really works out well when you're breaking in a new quarterback, and in that you've got really 4 tune-up games, 3 of them are at home, before you play in Iowa that's going to have a great defense. So I think from that standpoint, everything is laid out perfectly for Ohio State, but they drew Oregon, Penn State, and Michigan, which is a tough draw. I still think with all of that, I think that 10-2 is overly conservative. I'm going to go 11-1 for Ohio State this year. The other reason is where other teams have a hard schedule, a lot of that is because of sequencing, where they have 4 or 5 really good teams in a row, even though they're not all elite teams, and that's when you drop a couple of those. All of Ohio State's tough games, at least on paper now in the preseason, are spread out, which is also really good. So I'm going to go 11-1. You give me yours.
I also think Ohio State's likely to be an 11-1 team. There's enough. Again, there's 4 ranked teams preseason on the schedule. That's enough where you're probably going to drop one. Again, there are enough concerns I have on that. I think Oregon is the most likely to be dropped. Part of that is a matchup issue. Oregon does have a really good front. They have a really disruptive front. I think offensive line issues dealing with speed rushers is probably going to be Ohio State's Achilles heel, just like it was last year. I'm almost more concerned. Well, I am more concerned about Oregon than I am Michigan. Though I will say, I think Michigan's getting slept on a little bit as the preseason number 9. When I really go through their roster, I look at the transfers. They're going to be a beast again. I think they're better than they're getting made out to be. I think Michigan is clearly, in my opinion, a better team than Notre Dame on paper right now. But yeah, Oregon's the most likely, but I think they drop one of those. But I'm with you. I mean, they play at Oregon, then they get a bye week before Nebraska, and then Nebraska before Penn State. I think the one tricky part, and that's why I said that, is Iowa before they play at Oregon. Iowa's always a physical, difficult game, and I think that makes the Oregon game tougher. But otherwise, it is a nice sort of balance of easy, hard, easy, hard. It's what you want. That's the common refrain with Big Ten fans with FCS, with the SEC. It's not so much they play FCS. The current argument is, well, but they play an FCS late, so it gives them a chance to rest. I would argue that I don't know that it really matters if you're getting an FCS team the same week somebody else does. So if you're both resting, it's like you both have a bye. It doesn't really give anybody an advantage. Maybe if it was a playoff and one's playing an FCS, before they play a Big Ten team or something, that's a different discussion. But anyway, that's a different discussion for a different day. I think the schedule is probably set up to be an 11-1 schedule for Ohio State. I think they're a great team. I think they are going to be in the playoff. I think the transfers are going to determine the floor, but I think a lot of the ceiling is going to really come from the existing roster.
What's interesting about this year, Josh, is we haven't had a lot of good comparison with the SEC and the Big Ten in any given year, just because of how out-of-conference scheduling has worked out. But with USC and UCLA coming to the Big Ten now, we've got Alabama, Wisconsin, Michigan and Texas, UCLA and USC both play LSU. There's a lot of cross-contamination here that our model's going to love, but also giving us, because it's going to be harder to fill out a field of 12, but knowing that those two conferences are so far out ahead, who gets one more than the other might come down to how those regular season matchups work out, which to me is good because I want the regular season to matter. And I feel like, we're talking about 2, maybe 3 mulligans. I hate that. I hate it. Now, you don't have to go undefeated in the old world to get in the playoffs, but you do lose a lot of your, controlling your own destiny once you take a loss. Now you can take 3 and still get in. I don't love it, but if that's going to happen, I love that at least for now we've got some good Big Ten SEC cross points that we haven't had in the past.
Yeah, and as people know, we run a website, collegefootballnerds.com, where we'll put up statistics throughout the season. We have a thing where you can model any team versus any other team, and we've often said, and we even had a caveat on there, one, it's going to overrate teams with weak schedules. In my opinion, every computer model does that, and I know, like SP Plus, Bill Connolly's made several improvements to try to tamp down G5 teams for that reason. It's a known flaw in the way computer modeling works. But we also say that you can't really compare great between conferences because they exist in silos. I talk about it like a Polaroid, right? It's like if you have a picture of the Alps and you have a picture of the Himalayas, and you go, well, in this picture, this Alp looks taller than the other Alps. This one, these Himalayas all look the same, so I guess this Alps mountain is taller. That's the problem you have from a data perspective, is it's relative to the conference without trying to make the data relative through you beat Akron 50-6, whereas they beat Akron 40-13, doesn't work. Especially since nobody's really trying in that game, so it all just kind of breaks down. We need these out-of-conference touch points to help calibrate, and I do have some complicated stuff that we kind of devised to calibrate it, to be able to do that. We didn't have that last year when we ran the model, so that'll be nice. But especially within the conference, the one kind of good thing in the super conference is within the super conference, the data is really connected. So whereas before, basically take the Pac-12, split it in half, move it over with a Big 12 as well. The SEC within the Big Ten, we're going to have really good ability to model those teams within those two conferences relative to each other. The problem is comparing the Big Ten to the SEC rather than SEC to SEC or Big Ten to Big Ten. But I do agree with you. The number of out-of-conference data points, hopefully between really good teams, because that's another important part of it, will matter. Last year was awful because we had so many games we thought were going to be big, and one team or the other just ended up being bad. We talked a lot. The SEC had a really bad out-of-conference record, but that was really hard to use because most of the losses were coming from bad, SEC teams. Like Vandy lost twice, South Carolina lost twice, Florida lost, and they were the worst teams in the conference. That just doesn't tell us anything one way or the other, unfortunately. This year, I think we're going to have a much better idea by week 4, week 5 when we run the model where the conferences are relative to each other, and that'll be fun.
All right, y'all, that's it for us. This was a lot of fun. Remember, subscribe, comment what you think Ohio State's record is going to be this year, and if they're going to have a loss, which one is it going to be? What do you think about Howard at quarterback? Do you think that he's elite? Do you think they need him to be elite to win a national championship this year? And remember, if you want to share us somewhere, want to share this video where you talk football, we'll love it. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.